everyone, and welcome to the Right to Read Initiative. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Shelley Blackwell from Kansas, and you are an MTSS support specialist and a speech and language pathologist. So I'm really excited because you've agreed to talk to me 3 times. Today, we're focusing on your story, so understanding how you got to the position you are today. And then we're going to talk about your role as an MTSS support specialist. And in our final conversation, we're going to be talking about the implementation science. And I'm so excited for that one because throughout the things that I've done over the years, it's critical that implementation happens effectively. We have that fidelity assessment.
Yeah, and I would add not just implementation, but the de-implementation, and understanding that de-implementation doesn't mean abandonment. So yes, it's going to be a great conversation. We'll leave it there and let him come back.
Exactly. So why don't you give listeners just a little bit of background about what you're doing today?
Okay, yes. So my position, my title is an MTSS Literacy Support Specialist. And in my school district, we have about 30,000 students. We have 36 elementaries. We provide support for 10 middle schools, 5 high schools, and then we've got about 4 or 5 alternative education buildings as well. So we have a team of us. There's 11 of us to support all of that. And this job started last year as a result of, we were actually got to use ESSER funds to try to make up some of the lost at time from learning during the pandemic. So we actually at that point too, our state rolled out a dyslexia mandate. And so our districts had to make a shift. If we weren't doing structured literacy, we had to start implementing universal screeners and phonics core instruction. And so the timing of it really fell in beautifully because they were able to hire us using this funding to implement this new core instruction for literacy. So basically my job is to go into teachers' classrooms. I go into PLCs and we work on understanding the core phonics materials, how to teach it with fidelity. Also, there's some teacher education. Some of them are still making that shift from balanced literacy to structured literacy. So trying to help them understand the why and the research behind that without getting into too deep of a college course type of conversation. But and so then the other piece is we've really reinstated an MTSS process. And so we're teaching teachers how to use data to make decisions about, do we need an MTSS tier 2 intervention? If so, what does that look like? How do we know when we're done with that? Do we need to go tier 3? What does that look like? When do we need to go to SPED? And so we'll talk a lot about that in our next meeting. But that's a lot of my job is going in and supporting teachers and helping them build that knowledge so that they can then use data, knowledge, information to use their teacher wisdom and make decisions for student learning.
Of course. Now, I'm assuming you didn't start out as a speech and language pathologist right out of high school. So let's rewind the clock back a little bit. What was high school like for you? And where did you decide to go when you finished?
Okay. I didn't like high school. Was not a fan. I was, though, in everything. I was in leadership. I was the president of a bunch of clubs. I was kind of considered a smart dork, but that's fine. I played the flute. I was in band. I played piano. And I really enjoyed learning. And so out of high school, I thought I wanted to go into medicine. The body fascinated me. The brain fascinated me. And I thought I knew I wanted to do something of service. So that seemed like a really good fit. So I went to college going pre-med. And the fall of my freshman year, I had to have an 8-hour glucose tolerance test. And so they drew blood every hour for 8 hours. And I sat there and I was like, I can't even watch her draw the blood. How am I going to do things like that, let alone the big stuff. So I kind of decided at that point, medicine probably was not for me, but I was still really fascinated with anatomy and physiology. And my mom, actually, I'm a fifth generation educator. So I grew up with a teacher as my mom, and my sisters were teachers too. And so I thought maybe education's where I need to be. So I shifted to education, and I liked it, but I didn't love it. I wasn't sure I wanted to be in a classroom for 30 years, but I knew I would be fine. So I was still kind of trying to figure it out. Well, then I happened to take a class called speech, language, hearing. And it really was just about child development and their language. And I was hooked. That was so intriguing to me. And so I left the small school I was at. I had done my freshman and sophomore year at a private school in Iowa. They didn't have speech language pathology. So then I transferred to KU, University of Kansas, who had one of the top programs at the time. And I finished my bachelor's in that. I really loved the language piece of it. The speech piece was interesting, and I got to have some of the medical side as well. So I got kind of appeased both the teaching and the medical science side. But then I decided to stay at KU for my graduate degree. So I went straight into my master's. I don't know how Canada is, but in the United States, you cannot practice as a speech pathologist without your master's. So I really had to go straight in. I stayed at the University of Kansas and finished my master's. And there I actually got to work in the labs of Dr. Hugh Katz and Dr. Mark Fay. So I was hooked, right? So here I've got these two amazing mentors, and I'm learning about language. And at that time, during one of the summers, I was asked by a lady from church who I grew up with her kids. She said, "Hey, you're in speech pathology, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Do you want to come work at my literacy clinic for the summer?" And I thought, sure, it's fascinating. Sure. Paid well. And at that point, that was really important. But I ended up she trained me in the Lindemood Bell method. Mm-hmm. So I watched the work that I was doing and that we were doing as a clinic to helping kids learn how to read over the summer. It was intense. I mean, some kids came 5 days a week for 4 hours a day. It was very, very intensive, but it was working. And so here I am. I remember I had one high school boy who had some cognitive delays, and he went from a non-reader to a reader in the summer we worked together. So I got the bug. I had the bug from my school. I got the bug from the clinic. And so I stopped working at the clinic when fall started because I was going back to school. And one of the owners that had recruited me, decided to sell her part of the clinic. And she wrote a science of reading curriculum for grade school, for schools. Mind you, this is 1997. So this is a while ago. So she was really on the cutting edge of realizing, we're missing something. Prior to her clinical time, she was a first grade teacher. And so she was on her own journey, and she asked me to come work with her. And so we went around and trained teachers for 5 days how to implement phonemic awareness and phonics and all of those foundational supports in their classrooms. And so I did that while I was in grad school. And then part of that also, I got to go into classrooms and model lessons and give feedback and coach teachers who were teaching it. So I got to be really engrossed in this content early on in my career. When I graduated with my master's, I got a quote real job, one that has benefits and pension, all that. And I couldn't work with her anymore. And so I took what I had learned to my school district and started to spread science of reading. We were deep in a balanced literacy approach. And I remember walking into a classroom, seeing those little posters saying, "Get your mouth ready, get a running start, look at the picture." And I thought, what is this? Because I had never experienced it. I had only experienced science of reading. And so this was foreign to me. And so I started asking my kindergarten and first grade teachers, "Hey, can I come in and do some lessons? Can I do some phonemic awareness? Can I teach some phonics?" And they were like, "Yeah, come on in." So I got to go into classrooms and start teaching some of those things. So I was a speech language pathologist at the elementary level most of my career. And then I had 1 year at a middle school and 2 years at a high school, but in total, 22 years. So that's my SLP background. So then this job came open. Actually, let me back up. About 3 years ago, I decided there was more for me. I was ready to spread my wings. I loved my job as an SLP. I loved my students. It just felt like there was more for me. I didn't know what, but I knew there was something. So I decided to go back to KU to get my doctorate. I call it my trifecta, giving them a lot of money. And I got my doctorate in speech language pathology with an emphasis in dyslexia and professional learning, with my intent being if I can specialize in those things, perhaps I can take it to a school district and give them some deeper insight, whatever. Well, graduated, this job became available. It was a perfect fit for me because it was all about professional learning and teaching teachers. And I was doing SOR all day, every day. And so it's been amazing. It's been a really great job. And the 100-ish teachers that I support, we've gone through a big journey, and it's been really fun to watch them learn. And this year, our funding ends. And so we were supposed to set up a system for sustainability. Mm-hmm. And so what's been really cool is sitting in PLCs and they say, okay, Shelley, what do we do? I have this and I have this and I have this. And I'd say, well, where would you start if I wasn't here? What would you do first? And they'd talk, and I'd say, okay, let me give you some other thoughts, some information, and then see what you want to do. So I'd drop some nuggets of content and approaches and considerations, and to watch them go from last year going, I don't know what a morpheme is. What are you talking about? To being able to start problem solving and looking at data. It's just been amazing. It's been awesome.
It is. And the nice thing when you're in positions like you and I are in, you know that the work you do is reaching more than the students you can actually work with, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So because you're helping support these teachers this year and promoting that professional development, the hundreds and thousands of students that you're going to reach over their career is amazing.
Yeah. I mean, even just, I thought about that too, because my caseload, I would have anywhere between 45 and 70 kids on my caseload. Now, not all of them needed literacy, but a big chunk did. But if I have, let's just round up, I have 100 teachers, give or take. If they each have 25 kids in their class, that's between 2,000 to 2,500 kids that I'm able to reach through them. Mm-hmm. And empowering those teachers to think through the process and help them see things through a different lens is so gratifying for me. That's my bucket fills, to see them, you know, when kids have the light bulb experience, when I see the teachers go, okay, now I know this is why we're doing this. I get it. And they see the growth and the gains. And I am a misty-eyed person. I cry all the time. And so I'll be in meetings. I'm like, you guys, I'm crying. And, mm-hmm. you know, whatever, but it just is so moving and gratifying to see that growth.
Of course. Now, one thing that I love is that you're an SLP with a specialization in dyslexia, mm-hmm. and, you know, professional development, which is amazing because it's something that's often forgotten. I know where I am in Canada, the SLP typically focuses on the students with articulatory issues. And we're not seeing that use and taking advantage of the time that we can get so much growth, especially in those first early years when we're working with students in the K1-2 or pre-K1-2 and helping them with their phonological awareness and their phonemic awareness. Now, there's so many debates about the amount and the type of instruction, and, you know, should we be doing a program like Haggerty every day, 5 days a week, for the entire year? Is that needed? Is that necessary? I think it is a great program and a great resources for teachers to have, but it's not something that you need to implement by the book your entire career. And as you get more knowledge, you're able to take that knowledge and use it effectively in your classroom. But something like Haggerty is a great resource to have those activities right there where you don't have to come up with it on the spot in your head, because that takes a lot of effort.
Right, for sure. And that's something, one of the pieces that our team has been trying to teach our teachers as we are out in PLCs, is talking about how, I mean, last year we adopted 95% group for our core and our intervention. And so we really followed the recipe. We followed it verbatim. And as teachers are getting more comfortable with that and using it with fidelity and seeing the growth and seeing the nuances in student response, we can start to empower them to say, okay, so you see this score, what does that mean? Were they automatic? Were they not? What do we need to include into the lesson? Or is the lesson, it's very scripted, but there are also some students, especially with IEPs, that learn a little differently, and they need those repetitions for sure, and a scripted predictability to build those long-term connections. But sometimes we might need to add a little something. And so, if we need to work on the phonemic awareness component, we can maybe add a little bit. And the other piece that I love talking about is spelling. I did a session at the Reading League conference this fall, and it was on spelling. And I said, I like to say spelling is the window to a student's literacy soul, so to speak, because when you see their written work, you can tell, are they missing phonology? Are they omitting sounds? Do they have the orthographic representation? Are they making phonological mistakes or orthographic mistakes? Are they making morphological mistakes? And I can get all of that just from a writing sample. And so part of what I've been trying to share with my teachers too is teaching them how to do that, to look at their spelling list and not just go, well, you got 2 out of 10. Well, what kind of errors were they making? And what does that mean for what you're going to do with them next? That test should be a guide for what your instruction will be. And it's been kind of a big shift to have teachers start thinking about this and thinking about how spelling isn't just the subject that can go away if you have a busy day. It's an integral piece of literacy development, and here's how you can use it. So that's been fun to teach too. I kind of tangented off to that, but to your point about PA, there are lots of, I prefer David Kilpatrick's 1 minute exercises. I like those a lot, but that's not the end all be all. There's not only one thing. And we also need to consider, is what we're doing what that student needs? Or are we just doing it for the sake of doing it?
Yeah. Well, the thing that I love about spelling error analysis is how much it tells you. Actually, in my dissertation, I was looking at Chinese first language students who entered kindergarten with very little or no English, and looking at them in grades 2, 3, and 4. And so I did tests in English and Chinese, depending whether it was Mandarin or Cantonese based on their first language, and looking at their phonological awareness and their spelling. And I did an error analysis and looked at the relationship between it. And it was very, very, I don't know, I'm a geek when it comes to this stuff. Like, I love looking at it. I'm like, oh, so they're not hearing this and they don't understand the concept of this morpheme. And so, they need this explicit instruction because how they learn Chinese and reading Chinese doesn't apply, right? You need to have that conceptual understanding of morphology to help you understand the spelling patterns, and being conscious of the minimal pairs in English. And I've looked at things and teachers are like, oh, I have no idea why they put a G in this word when that should have been a C. Well, actually, it's because they're struggling with that minimal pair, that voiced and that unvoiced sound.
And even making that connection of that, we hear oftentimes that English is so crazy and so confusing and so unpredictable, and it's not. It's very predictable in so many ways. If you start looking at the morphemes and the etymology, then you can start to see why we spell sign, S-I-G-N, and we spell signature, S-I-G, because it all comes from the same morpheme family. I went at the Reading Lead Flintstone had a session that I went to and just ate it up, of course. And she was talking about PTER and how that means like wing, so pterodactyl and helicopter.
Yeah.
If we start to see those pieces, it explains why we spell things the way we spell them. It also helps with meaning and decoding and those pieces. But when I've shown those types of things, teachers are like, oh my gosh. I mean, I knew that, but I had no idea why that happened. And that's fun to share too. And back to your point of spelling analysis, looking at the word walked, if they spell it W-O-K-T,
yeah,
part of me, the SLP in me is like, you heard every single sound, way to go. Well,
yeah.
You got all those sounds. And then the orthography piece of it's like, well, you assigned a spelling that made sense, but we don't have that phonics connection yet, or the morphology connection to say walk is a verb. Walked is something that's already happened. How do I mark regular past tense, ed? And why does it sound like why does it sound like d or ed, and those components to it? And so I think empowering teachers to learn and know how to analyze their spelling will help them be stronger literacy teachers. But the capacity, I mean, teachers, it's a really hard time to be a teacher. It's a really hard time. We all thought COVID was the bad year. It's hard. It's tough. And I think a lot of the teachers in our district want to learn all there is to learn and want to serve as best they can serve, but their capacity is full given their own stress. We've rolled out so many new initiatives as well at the same time. So they're learning new universal screener, new core phonics, MTSS process, math MTSS process. It goes on. And so I think that goes back to our implementation conversation. But it's hard. It's not a lack of want. I think we're getting the buy-in from our district that we've needed for a very long time.
That's wonderful. You're so lucky that you're in a place that's happening, because there's still so many places where it's not. And, I think it's really important to have that perspective that we are asking a lot of our teachers. And this science of reading journey is a deep dive situation where they're having, in some cases, to throw out everything that they've known. And once they get more involved, deal with that guilt of understanding that the way that they were teaching wasn't reaching all of their students. And that's difficult.
The grief.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And with that, some of our conversations in PLCs, I often will say, they'll ask for my opinion on something, and I'll say, let me give you two ways to think about it. Here's best practice. If in an ideal world, here's exactly what it would look like. Here's reality. So what part of this can we put in? We may not be able to do this yet for whatever reason. Maybe it's class size, maybe it's the behaviors, maybe it's whatever where they are on their journey. But if I can help them say, here's perfection, here's ideal, what part can we do? Let's start there. And let's start with that. And then let's see what we can add in. How can we pull as much of this into your reality as possible so that you can be successful and start seeing some results and knowing you're teaching kids the way that they need to be taught and how they can learn. So I don't know if you can see over my shoulder, I have progress over perfection.
Yeah.
Because that's a message too that I think as teacher leaders, as administrators, as coaches, we need to talk about that I think educators want to be perfect. We want to do it right the first time, and we want to do it with excellence. That's not how learning happens. You don't go out and try golf for the first time and you're Tiger Woods. Like that just It takes practice. So instead of perfection, we want to see progress. And if you're making progress on this journey of science of reading and learning the content and learning the research and the theories and the implementation of it, then you're on the right track. And I think that helps teachers kind of say, okay, you're not asking me to go run a marathon. You're asking me to run 3 miles. I can do it.
Right, for sure. Now I want to go back to your experience. So when you first get out of your master's, you're working in the schools as in a supporting role. How did that look, and how did that affect what you were doing and your knowledge based on what you learned in your experience with that reading support center?
Yeah. So back in the early 2000s, it wasn't common to see SLPs doing literacy interventions. And a couple of my school psychs, when I would bring in literacy testing and goals, they kind of looked at me like, shouldn't the resource teacher do this? And so I had an opportunity to really advocate for our scope of practice, that all of this language, reading is a language-based action, writing is a language-based action. And part of my title is language. This is so in my scope of practice. Quick side note, our district, our state has been supporting many districts to get their letters training. And so when I went through with my team, who are all gen ed teachers, I was like, yep, I got this, because it's like SLP 101. They said, we had no idea that SLPs had this knowledge. We had no idea this is what they did. So it's a good opportunity for me to also advocate for what we have to bring to the table. But with that, I was working with kids who at the time, we didn't diagnose dyslexia. We weren't even allowed to say that word. But I know I had students who had that. And so I just looked at their characteristics, and looked at their progress and designed my intervention that way. But in my department, I was probably one of 4. At that point, we had about 45 SLPs in our department. Years down the road, we had to have about 70 now. And we were before I left that position, we were in a PLC meeting for us. And the question was asked, how many of you think that dyslexia or reading literacy interventions are part of your job? And only half of us raised our hands. And I was like, okay, all right. So it kind of became my mission to teach, to educate, to say, it is part of our practice. And here's what that could look like in your SLP room. Here's what it could look like when you're doing informal evaluations or whatever. So I ended up being kind of a leader in our district. I was the literacy go-to. The beautiful thing about SLP is, because our scope of practice is so big, we ended up having lots of experts in those different things. So if somebody had a cleft palate client or student, I could call so-and-so and they were the expert, or social skills, I could call so-and-so. So I was the literacy person. So within my school, my teachers were extremely supportive of giving me their kids to work with on literacy. They didn't oppose me targeting those skills at all. So I was very lucky. But I also produced results too. So they saw what I was doing and getting kids moving, whereas balanced literacy approach wasn't. So I probably overserved technically, because there were so many instructional casualties, not from the teacher, but so I should say curricular casualties, because the teachers did everything they were supposed to do. They were using a curriculum that wasn't going to reach all the kids. So I tangent a lot, don't I?
That's okay. Now, one thing that I wanted to discuss is the importance in those first few years of schools to identify and remediate these phonemic awareness difficulties in the percentage of the population that is at risk. because with a trained ear, you can recognize these things early on and intervene early, even in some of those pre-K years, so that the student is in a better situation to succeed.
Right. So part of my job in the school was to work with preschool kids age 3 and up before they came to school who had articulation errors. Not like the interdental S, the TH for S, but significant errors that were those precursors to, or red flags to, this kid could have some literacy difficulties because they're not hearing all the sounds, they're not making the sounds correctly, things like that. And so I was able to, with my background, to talk with those teachers, or those parents, excuse me, to say, here's some things you can be doing at home. Here are some things I want you to watch out for when they go to kindergarten and first grade. So I could educate those parents as well, and gave them things to do at home for PA development and language development while I was working on their articulation skills, primarily in our speech sessions. I would incidentally be putting in a whole lot of language and wordplay and PA, those types of things, but those weren't my goals for IEP, for speech services. But I took the opportunity to talk with my parents to equip them with things to look for, things they can do at home. And then at my school, my kindergarten teachers, before we had a curriculum that included phonemic awareness, I would go in, usually it was 3 times a week. If I had a lower caseload, I'd go in 5 times a week and do a PA lesson with kids every day. Go in and do a 15-minute lesson with them. And it was great for me because I could start to eyeball some of those kids that may be at risk later. So when they got into first grade, I could be like, I saw that in kindergarten. This is a trend, or whatever, but informally. So I was lucky in my school. I'm not sure all of the SLPs felt equipped to do that, or all the teachers at that time were willing to have an SLP come in. There are a few of us in the district that did, but things have come a long way since then.
Well, and that's where I feel the importance of your work with Linda Mood Bell came in. Not everybody is familiar with Linda Mood Bell. It is an older program, but it takes that Orton Gillingham method of instruction and incorporates the SLP component to it. So it takes it one step higher and helps the student with the articulation and the phonemic awareness at a deeper level. Orton Gillingham has started to incorporate those more in the recent years, but Linda Mood Bell has been doing this a long time.
A long time, yeah. And you're right. I mean, thinking about when I was being trained at Linda Mood Bell, I was also taking courses on phonetics, and I think that they both helped each other. My phonetics course helped me learn the Linda Mood Bell, all the articulatory gestures and noticing what your mouth is doing, and vice versa. So that was kind of a perk. But I do know that I have taken a lot of those aspects of Linda Mood Bell, not now exactly the way it's written, but I can talk to teachers and say, if they're, those kids who sound out the word and they make all the sounds correctly, and then they say a completely different word, and teachers are like, what do I do with that? And so we can talk about, well, what sound did you make here? What did your mouth do? Okay, when you said this other word, did your lips pop? Did they come together? No, they didn't. Okay, let's make that match. Let's match this to that. So teaching them to bring attention to the mouth and what your mouth is actually doing has just given them, the teachers, another tool in their tool belt to reach kids if they're struggling at that tier 1 and tier 2 level in the classroom. So
yeah, and with a little bit of time and effort, I mean, we do ask so much of our teachers, and they only have so many hours in the day, and they don't all have to be dedicated to teaching. But when you can understand the articulatory gestures or the shapes that the mouth makes when forming the sounds, as well as understanding the difference between a voiced and an unvoiced sound, you are setting yourself up for a deeper understanding of where your students are struggling. And that will help you when it comes to error analysis to see, oh, okay, well, I understand why they chose that GPC or grapheme phoneme correspondence or the phonics representation, because maybe they're pronouncing the word with their mouth in this position, and I can get that. And as an individual myself with dyslexia, I know that I do still have a problem with phonemic awareness. And I remember in university, I had friends named Craig, and I had friends named Greg. And I'd say the wrong name. And I'm like, no, I know you're not. I know you're Craig, not Greg, but it's just happened. I'm sorry. And having those slip ups. When I was younger, I remember having a Braden and a Brandon. And to me, those names were so similar. And I'd be thinking one. I know which one I was supposed to say.
Yeah.
I'd say it wrong.
Yeah. Well, and you reminded me of a spelling error that often happens in the younger grades is for like train, kids would do CHR. And so train. And so teachers have come to me and said, oh my gosh, and they're really concerned. And I was like, let's back up a second. This co-articulation thing changes our sounds a little bit. And when you say here's where your lips go. Guess what else makes your lips go that way? CH. And when you're putting that R there, so they're thinking they're hearing it right. They're not far off, but we do have a disconnect, but it's not as far as you think, because they're like T and C, those aren't even close.
Yeah.
Well, we got to go to the sound. We got to go to the mouth, because the letter doesn't always match, and there's more to it. And so in helping them understand those differences, and the voicing, is another piece of just education that we learn along the way.
Of course. And then if in the classroom you notice a student that's making atypical substitutions, so not the ones that all kids make, right? They're the ones where I can remember one kid that would say Vincent instead of Vincent, or Cedric instead of Frederick. And those are the ones where we see the problems with the articulatory gestures and recognizing the difference between those sounds, because how it's pronounced is very different than the substitution that they are using. So those are the ones that we're going to want to move up to that higher level of support.
And the SLP in me then says, okay, they made a substitution B for V. Do they do that across all V words? If so, then we've got a phonological articulation, error where they've made a mismatch in their brain. So it may not be a literacy thing. It may be a speech phonological thing. However, if kids are struggling with that, odds are they're going to be struggling with the literacy piece too. So then you're starting to look at patterns. Is this an isolated substitution, or do they do this all the time? TH for S. A lot of kids substitute TH for S, W for R. Or W for L. If it's across lots of words, then we probably need to go back to, can you produce it correctly? And then I can also do some receptive work to say, can you tell if these sounds are different? Wed, red, are those the same words or different? If they can perceive it, but they're not pronouncing it, then it's likely I can correct the speech sound. And then let's see how it affects literacy.
Well, and another thing we haven't discussed yet is working with our English language learners. So these are students that have English as an additional language that they are learning. And we need to consider their first language and the phonemes in that language and how they relate to English. Because especially when we're working with young children, this is the time that we can help them get that naturalization of the English sounds, that long-term we're going to reduce or eliminate the accent. Not because we don't want it, but because they can actually hear those sounds and articulate them.
We had a student who, in their language, the TH sound was pronounced like a T.
Yeah.
We all said his name with a TH because that's what was there. And he would always be like, why do you keep saying my name wrong? And we're like, but it's spelled that way. And he explained, but it was early on in my work with ELLs. And I was like, ooh, I need to do this differently. But to your point of like, we need to make sure that we're not misinterpreting their language as errors in ours, because it may not be. They may not have a certain sound, or they may not have, it's like we don't have the guttural R that French has. Just because I can't make it doesn't mean I'm impaired. It means I'm a French language learner, lots of things to consider as they develop.
Well, and an interesting, like I have 3 children who have all started early French immersion, and I'm not good at that guttural R. I can do it sometimes, but not all the times. And my children have mastered it, and they're like, oh yeah, la 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 la. I'm like, can you do this about me? I'm like, nope. Even my 5-year-old that's just started kindergarten has figured it out so quickly.
That's awesome. Quick side note, Kim Lockhart on Twitter. I love it when she posts videos of her teaching because I just love hearing her French. I'm like, that's amazing. My sister was a French teacher, and so she's fluent in French, and listening to her talk as well. And she was in the corporate world, but it's beautiful. But I took 4 years of French, and I was not proficient at the guttural R.
Yeah.
But so I do English words, English, not numbers.
Everybody has their specialty, right?
That's right. That's right.
How do you feel we could make the biggest difference in our students' life as a whole when it comes to literacy instruction based on your background?
I think that's a really big question, by the way. I think our place to start is teacher education, building their capacity for the knowledge, the understanding, and then knowing what to do with it. And I say that because I've gotten to witness that the movement some of our teachers have made in the year and a half that we've been able to be in buildings and doing this coaching and such. Because then when they understand this, I'm reading this book called Schools on the Move, and I tweeted it. It said something about how instructional proficiency has to happen first. We have to know how to teach our content, and we have to know how our instruction is affecting students. And at that point is when we will see student growth. And so I really think it comes down to teacher education, knowledge, and capacity, and then support in implementing that with fidelity. I hate that term because I feel like it's overused. Implement with fidelity, but it's also true. And actually, who said this? Instead of implementation with fidelity, we might consider implementation with integrity. And that was a really interesting concept to me because it kind of gave me that thinking of like the recipe. I need to follow the recipe exactly as is when I first make it. And then once I learn how to do it, then I can start to tweak it. I can start to say, I'm still going to make homemade rolls, but I'm going to add this instead. And I'm going to take this out, or chili's maybe a better idea. I'm going to add a little more spice. I'm going to instead of ground beef, I'm going to use bison, or, what you can start making small little shifts that change it, but I still made chili. So I'm still implementing it. And I think the implementation with integrity message can be dangerous if teachers don't understand the content first and the research and the thinking. But once they achieve that, once they get proficient at their instruction of the content, then I think they've got that ability to cater it to their students' needs, as long as we're still teaching structured literacy. As long as we're still using systematic explicit phonics for our word recognition and spelling instruction. But you and I may teach it just a little differently. We may both have the same lesson and show it a little differently.
That's right? Okay.
That's okay, as long as we're in the parameter of teaching it with a systematic and explicit process. So to me, that's what that implementation with integrity is. So I think the biggest impact, the quickest impact we can make is to educate teachers, not just on what the research says and the why, but also on the how, and then what to do when it's not working for a kid, when they're not making the progress we think they should be making. How do we adjust our interventions? And that'll go right to our MTSS conversation of how to move through that process, that fluid process of making it more intense, less intense, maybe nothing, maybe they need more. So as much as I'd like to say an easier answer, I think the conversations, I feel like the work that my team is doing with teacher education, given the lucky position we're in to be able to actually get into PLCs and get into buildings and build those relationships, to have those vulnerable conversations about, I'm not comfortable doing this. I don't understand why we're doing this. Can you help me? We've been able to build those relationships so they trust us. And so we can have conversations of, I get this, but why the heck are we doing this? And why aren't I doing the FMP? I need to FMP my kid. Hold on, let's have a conversation. But, teaching them the why is something that I think helps them understand the how.
Definitely.
So teacher education, that's my answer.
And having the support for the teachers as they're implementing it. So many times teachers will go to, or anyone will go to a professional learning program or professional development. They grade it. They are excited during the training. They really enjoy it. They're sure they're going to use it in the classroom or back in the real world, but they don't remember it exactly how it was taught. I mean, it was only 8 hours or however long it was. So having that person that you can be open, honest, and vulnerable with, saying, look, I need help. Can you help me figure out how to do this? Is the best way we can to move forward, and making sure that we have individuals in the position with the expertise to support them.
Right.
And not the ones that are learning along with them.
And there's some research out there that talks about how when you just go to the presentation, you just go to the training, the odds of it being implemented the way it's intended to be implemented are small. But if you add in the coaching, the support, I think I'd have to go back and look, but I think it was like 99% odds of having success with it. And I have to shout out to my district for allowing us, creating these positions so that we can go in and help them and be that liaison between, here's the district initiative and here's my classroom. And you're right, between PD on August, when you learn what the program is and what you're supposed to do, to actually doing it day in and day out through all the bumps on your own, it doesn't work as well. It's a lot harder for teachers to implement with fidelity or integrity. And then the teachers may say, well, it doesn't work, so I'm not going to do it anymore because it's not working. I'm going to go back to the old way. Well, maybe it's not working because you haven't been really shown how to do it and you don't have that support.
Yeah.
So I don't blame them on that, but it's what happens, and that it's not moving us forward. So.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Blackwell. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I look forward to our upcoming conversations.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been so fun. And I was just thinking, gosh, we could talk forever, couldn't we? But we got 2 more episodes, so tune in. Thank you for having me and for the work you do too.
You're welcome.